Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Parenting Pickup, a podcast simply made to help families with trending topics and so much more. We are positive you will pick up tidbits of helpful tips, tricks, activities, and advice when listening to our podcast. I'm your host, Kara. Hello. We're excited to have MiaLisa joining us today. Welcome, MiaLisa.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're so excited to have you as a guest again on our podcast. We're excited to learn more about you. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a wife and a mom, and I have 3 kids. I have a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old, and they're so much fun. And I'm kind of a work in progress, right? Who's always learning and growing and really trying to live into my role as a mom and striving to do things better and appreciate the little moments in life. But I'm also the executive director of Doing Good Together, and I've been in that role for about a year and a half. And our mission is really about providing tools for families to raise kids who care and contribute. But I do have a background beyond working with families. While I've worked with families in various capacities for 20 years or so, I also am a lawyer, and I worked in mediation and restorative practices for a while too. And one of the roles that I played is that I used to teach continuing legal education credits for lawyers and community members who wanted to be mediators, which is kind of a really fun and interesting sort of niche, right? Mediation's this process where 2 parties who are in the midst of a conflict can come together and try to have a conversation that's meaningful and also try to work toward some kind of a resolution. And one of the most important pieces of that kind of mediation is that we really talk about listening a lot and how to listen deeply. And you'd think that that's kind of a kindergarten level skill because it's one of the things our kids are taught at such a young age. But actually, it's just not as easy as you think. In practice, it's pretty hard to listen deeply and well and to really hear someone and the intent of what they're saying. And so I'm really glad to be here today to talk a little bit about the idea of listening from a parenting perspective, because it's kind of the nexus of the different kinds of work that I've done.
Agreed. You have such a rich background, and I think all your experience as a lawyer and in working in mediation is really beneficial in helping us as parents be listeners. And that's really what you're here to talk to us today about, is empathetic listening. So tell us a little bit about why this is so important for parents to be empathetic listeners.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about this topic too, because it really is one of my favorites. And I feel like it's important because we all know that listening's an important thing, a good skill as parents. But I think that it's also one of the true gifts that we can give our kids. There's a quote that's from Catherine M. Wallace that I absolutely love. I'm sure you've heard it before, but it's listen earnestly to anything your children want to tell you, no matter what. If you don't listen eagerly to the little stuff when they're little, they won't tell you the big stuff when they're big, because to them, all of it's big stuff.
Wow. I mean, that just makes me take a pause as a parent and think about how powerful that is, how important it is to just listen, because it's true. When you're little, when you're coming to your parent to tell them something, what may seem small and trivial to an adult is actually a huge, big thing in their life. Like they weren't invited to someone's birthday party, or they feel sad about something. So yeah, I think that's a wonderful quote and really a good example of why empathetic listening is so important.
Yeah, I agree. It's one of those quotes that I try to remind myself of periodically, because as a parent, it can be so easy because our kids want to really tell us things all the time, and it's hard to be present all the time.
Absolutely.
I also think that many of us actually think that we're really good listeners, but in truth, humans, all of us, myself included, we don't do it as well as we think. And that part of that is about attention and focus, because we've spent so much of our lives, especially as parents, multitasking. I feel like I'm always doing at least 5 things at once as a mom. And I think that multitasking sort of piece makes it hard to really stop and focus and listen really deeply sometimes, and that I have to remind myself of that quote and how important it is to really focus and listen and pause. And so I think that's a really important piece of this. And what I just said is very anecdotal, right? But there's research that actually backs this up as well about listening. There's the research actually, when you dig into it a little bit, it tells us that we really only listen with about 25% efficacy. That's crazy low, isn't it?
Wow.
And then on top of it, we are actually forgetful and distracted 75% of the time.
Oh my gosh, those numbers are worth repeating because it is just shocking. I think most of us think we are decent listeners, though I think to your point that we are, as parents, multitasking a bunch. And I think technology is great, but it's also a great distractor. It's really easy to have someone talking to you while you're quickly sending and responding to a quick work email or a quick, let me add this to my grocery list, I know we need eggs, and not fully listening. So I think that research is just rich and really gives us pause to think about how important it is to listen. So can you tell us a little bit more about why it's important to listen to children?
Absolutely. So I'm going to give you one more quote here. I promise I won't give you too many quotes today, but I love this one too. And I think it speaks to your question just so beautifully. This one's David Osberger. Being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they're almost indistinguishable. That idea of listening can be equated with love sometimes for kiddos and for us. I mean, to your point, when you're on the phone and trying to listen to someone and swiping and adding to the list, which I'm guilty of too, right? We all are.
Absolutely.
Right? How does it make you feel?
Right. It makes you feel not important, not as valued. I've had that where, like, whether it's my husband or my children, and thinking like, you're definitely not listening to me. You're not looking at me. You're on your phone. Can you actually hear what I'm saying? And so it's interesting to tie feeling loved with listening. That really makes just crystal clear how important it is.
Yeah, and I think deep listening or active listening is something that we actually have the power to get better at, right? There's so many things in life that it's hard to actually get better at, but this one isn't one of them. You can actually very mindfully and easily get better at this with a little bit of intention. And so I think that's one of the reasons I like this topic, because with some tips, with some really intentional thought, you can turn something around and really be a focused listener and try your best at the times when you need to, because it's obviously hard to listen 100% of the time. That's just a really high expectation. But I think it's something that we can train ourselves and hone with practice. And so, some of the things that I talk about are letting kiddos speak without interruption, right? How often do we interrupt them? It just happens all the time.
Absolutely. And I think often without intention.
Mm-hmm. Yes, asking follow-up questions, those basic follow-up questions to show that you're actually paying attention to what they're saying, and refraining from judgment. It can sometimes be hard as a parent to refrain from judgment as someone's telling a story, especially when it's your kiddo. But that can really help when you're listening to them, to refrain from that judgment. Because listening without scrutiny actually shows someone that you truly, truly care about what they're saying. And it provides this safe, sort of authentic space for them where this honest exchange and connection can really happen. And so I think that it's that connection that we really, truly want. And that's why I think it's important to listen really well for our kiddos especially.
I think so too. And I think it's not only the short-term benefit of being an authentic listener, but it's also the long term, because we all know that as children grow, as teenagers, they tend to share less. But, to the quote that you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, if you listen when they're little, they'll always come to you to share more. And so I really appreciate your thought of, listening and being intentional, because we can get better. And I like that this is a skill that we can grow, because I think it's an important one to work on. And it's helpful with children and significant others and at work and everywhere. I mean, you can truly benefit everywhere from that. So kind of take us back to some basics on how do you listen?
Yeah. So, the basics are really, a little harder than it sounds, but it's definitely doable, right? So first, you have to stop and actually show an interest in what someone's saying. And kids are such good detectors of whether you're actually interested in something or whether you're kind of feigning interest, right? So they actually are really good at calling you out on that. So actual interest.
Yes, that's great. It totally makes sense to me. I know my oldest, he would grab my face and hold it in the moments when he knew I wasn't totally listening. Like he would grab my face and turn it towards him. And then that was my sign, is like, yep, I need to focus more on him and listening.
Absolutely. And then the next one is, don't interrupt. Let them speak in that uninterrupted kind of way. And then try to hear what's being said and listen for what's actually being communicated. So there's more to that than just listening, right? It's listening for the words that you're hearing. It's listening for what's not being said, which is sometimes just as powerful as what's being said. Listening to how it's being conveyed to you or how it's being said. And are there emotions that are attached with it? Is the child upset? Is the child happy? Is the child teary? Is the child angry? Right? So those are all pieces of how we communicate, and you're taking that all in as you're listening. And I think one of the challenges with listening is that many people really like to talk, myself included, which is why doing this podcast is so much fun. But at the same time, you want to share and connect and share stories that really connect with what someone else is saying. But sometimes that can be a distractor from actually listening because it can turn things around to be about you instead of about them. So thinking about that piece as well.
I agree. I think that's an excellent point, because a lot of times I think as someone's talking, you're formulating like, oh, well, I have a story like that. I have something I want to add. And so just kind of really being in the moment and being present to truly listen and not start thinking about how you want to respond is really kind of a basic thing we should all strive to do.
Absolutely. I think the other piece is trying to understand the subtext of what's being said. And I like to think of this a little bit like an iceberg. So if you can picture an iceberg, there's a piece of an iceberg that's kind of above the surface, right? And that might be what's being said. And then you can picture, if an iceberg is so much bigger underneath the surface, right? But that's what's not necessarily being said. And that's kind of that list of things that I talked about before. And so that subtext is really important. And so, for example, someone might say to you, or a kid might say to you, I'm so angry right now because you didn't play with me. Okay, so that's a pretty simple sentence. But the subtext might be, I'm sad that you didn't spend time with me when you said you would. So there's these other pieces that are actually below the surface that you kind of have to be listening for as well. So overall, the basic mechanics of listening are truly try to hear what the speaker's saying, help the speaker clarify their thoughts, acknowledge that you've heard and that you understand what the speaker is saying, help others to hear what they're saying if that's the role of the situation. And then think about a response or a follow-up or not, depending on what's appropriate in the situation.
It's really nice to think of that iceberg image, that really when someone's saying something that is kind of just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, because there's so much more lying underneath.
Absolutely.
That's really a great image, I think, to help us as parents think about, kind of dig deeper to learn more about what that statement really means and what we can do to help support our child, which is wonderful. I know we talk a lot about listening. You've shared some things about how to really listen, which is great. And I think in addition to just using our ears to listen and hearing, there's a lot more involved with body language. And so tell us a little bit more about kind of body language and what we should be looking for and doing to be an empathetic listener.
Yeah, so body language is definitely a piece of the listening puzzle for sure. There's actually 3 different pieces that I kind of break it down when I'm teaching about listening. So one of them is what I call attending skills, right? And that's kind of part of the body language piece. Do you look like you're listening? To your point about the grocery list with the eggs and scrolling on your phone, right? Do you actually look like you're listening? But there's other pieces too, like what are the nonverbals telling you? Of course, this has lots of cultural components to it because different cultures perceive listening in different ways. And so I'm just going to speak to what I see personally, right? And just take that as one sort of view. I want to just make sure I lay that out there. But for me, listening looks like someone turned toward me. Someone in the same room. Have you ever tried to have a conversation with someone in another room? Drives me nuts as someone who teaches about listening.
Agreed, me too. It's my greatest frustration. It's not a good conversation, just a bunch of shouting.
So someone in the same room, put down the iPhone, look at me, right? I want to see your eyes and connect with you. Appear interested in what I'm saying, right? And then notice the nonverbals. And then, not just that they're listening, but also, are they perceiving that I'm listening, right? So it's not just my listening. So I have this conversation with my husband on a regular basis where he says, I'm listening to you, and he can parrot back what I've said. But if I don't feel like he's actually listening, there's a layer of that that's important as well. I don't feel like there's an attending piece, right? And it's the same way with our kids. So attending skills are kind of the first piece of that. The second piece of it kind of takes it to a new level. I call them following skills. And the idea is that, do your questions or your silence actually show that you're listening, right? And silence can actually show that you're listening as well, as we've discussed a little bit. But asking questions can be helpful as long as your questions aren't taking it in a direction that you want to go, rather than in the direction that perhaps they want to share.
Well, that's an excellent point to really think about how the questions are important, but is it going down your path and your agenda versus what your child is trying to tell you? That's a really good thing to keep in mind as you're asking kind of follow-up and clarifying questions.
Yeah, and I think that some of the types of questions that really help to get at what someone's trying to tell are open-ended questions or clarifying or linking questions. So I'll give you some examples. Some open-ended questions would be things like, tell me more about, or how do you feel about, and then fill in the blank of whatever it is that you're talking about. What happened next, right? Help to keep them telling the story. Clarifying questions could be things like, you said you were angry. What does angry mean to you, right? Because that can mean different things to different people. You can really get to understand what someone's trying to tell you that way and better understand where their mind is. And then, of course, for linking questions are things like, help me understand how this is related to that. Because sometimes someone will tell you a story and it feels disconnected and you're not sure that you're actually following, but usually it makes sense to the person who's speaking. So asking questions to help link the story back together can also be really helpful in these following skills too.
That is wonderful advice. And I think too that it's helpful as a parent to think about how to make those connections. And I'm sure if we put ourselves in the shoes of our children, they feel really listened to when we take that step to try to make sure that we're fully understanding and connecting their story if it seems disjointed or we're not fully understanding everything they're saying.
Yeah. And then the last bit would be kind of responding skills. And so some of these would be paraphrasing content, right? So when someone says something to you, actually parroting back or summarizing what they're saying to make sure that you understood what it was that they were trying to convey. So that's really important. And then also reflecting feelings and emotions. That's another layer. So things like, it sounds like you're really angry, or I heard you say, and then fill in the blank. Those types of techniques really help to make someone feel heard. And then, of course, that summarizing piece is really important because people's stories aren't always linear. Have you noticed that?
Yes, and especially with young children, that it can kind of be all over the board.
It can be all over the board, and if they're telling you something, there can also be lots of names that are thrown around, names of kids at school, and sometimes it's actually a little hard to follow what they're saying. So making sure you use these paraphrasing and summarizing techniques to really be able to follow what they're trying to tell you is helpful, and they'll clarify for you, and they'll appreciate the fact that you're trying to follow their story and trying to understand.
Absolutely. And I think, again, it'll just make them feel like that you're truly listening, that you're actively listening, that you're listening with empathy. And I think that, again, time and time again, they'll be willing to come back and share more and talk more, and that will just grow as they grow. So I think that's really fabulous. So what advice would you give to kind of show your child that you're listening? Because you talked about that perception piece, and I agree. I have had conversations with my own children and other family members where they are listening and they can, as you said, repeat back what I've said, but my perception is they're absolutely not listening at all. And so how do we make sure that our children really understand that? And if I'm, doing self-reflection myself, my children have told me, Mom, I don't think you're listening. And it has been kind of to your point, MiaLisa, that I'm doing 5 million things and I am listening, but I'm also folding the laundry and, putting clothes in the washer and in the dryer, and I'm still listening, but probably in that moment I should just stop and truly listen. So give us some tips on what do we need to do to show our child that we're really listening?
Yeah, and some of these will be redundant, but I think that it's sometimes good to hear them more than once.
Absolutely. Sometimes every day.
Yes. So again, listening from the heart with empathy. And that really is about suspending judgment, because if you get judgy about what they're telling you, they're probably not going to continue to come and tell you things, right? So letting them tell their story, listening from the heart with that empathy. I'm going to say this again. I know I've said it a number of times here, but give your attention. Put that phone down. It's just so easy to keep scrolling or pick it up or do the laundry. So just giving that kind of a focus. For little kids, the idea of getting down to your child's level can be really helpful. Something about being eye to eye, and sometimes even making a connection, like putting a hand on a child's shoulder or arm, really says, I'm listening to you, I care about you, I want to hear what you're saying, with body language. And so that can be really helpful too. Encouraging them to talk about their feelings is another piece that I think is really important. Ask them, how did that make you feel, when it sounds appropriate. It can be really helpful when they have a range of feeling words that they can access to be able to articulate that well. So this is one piece that you can kind of practice with them. Even before they're telling you something, this can be just kind of a learning piece for them as they grow. We've got some really great resources at Doing Good Together about, feelings and how to articulate your feelings. And I think that can be helpful in these instances. I use I messages with my kids, so it's very easy when you're speaking to kind of generalize to the population and say, well, everyone feels like X, Y, and Z, right?
Sure. And we've all done that.
Yes, we certainly have. But trying to get our kids to speak for themselves, I feel this way when this happens because, right, that's a really important kind of skill to be able to speak for yourself, to articulate how you're feeling. And that's one that takes practice, right? It's kind of a muscle that needs to be exercised, a developmental skill for kiddos. So it's something to kind of work on with your kiddos. And in these moments, it's an opportunity to work on that a little bit as well.
I agree. That's great. That helps build that kind of self-advocacy skill for them.
Absolutely. And then I like to say this one too. I think it's important at times to listen to your kids when they come to you with something really important. But sometimes they talk to you at a time that you simply can't give the attention that you really want to give to a topic. I'm thinking my kid pulls my sleeve while I'm online at the grocery store about to check out. I can't have a really meaningful conversation with them at that time. And so making sure that you do actually have the time and space, and it's okay to say, I really want to talk to you about this and I want to hear your story, but I don't feel like I can listen fully and be present at this time. But I'd like to come back to this. I want to hear your story when I have enough time to be able to really focus on what you're saying. That's okay. I think that people understand that, and I would personally prefer that someone say that than to give me half of their attention.
I completely agree. Like when you said that, I thought, oh gosh, I would really love it if someone didn't have the time for me to use that kind of language with me and say, like, let's find another time, so I can truly listen. Would reinforce that I matter, would reinforce that for a child that they truly are cared about.
Yeah. And I think that the response is another piece of this as well when I think about advice. And as parents, it's our job sometimes to give advice to our kids. So I certainly don't want to say that you shouldn't do that, because it is a part of what we do as parents. However, sometimes when people are telling you something, they're not looking for advice. Sometimes they're just looking for you to listen and to be heard, and to know that someone has heard their story in general. And so sometimes saying something like, gosh, that sounds really hard, is enough.
For sure. Absolutely.
Especially as kids get older, right? So I think that's a really important piece, that you don't always have to be formulating the perfect response, the perfect answer, and that it's okay if you do need to respond, to take some time to do that. I actually remember being a young attorney and thinking, gosh, I need to be able to answer everyone's question right away at this time in the moment. And no one has that full expectation. It's okay to say, I need some time to think about this, or I need some time to research this, and as a parent, it's no different. We might not have the perfect answer for our kids right off the bat, and if you are needing to provide advice to them, it's okay to take some time and think about that and say, gosh, that's hard and I want to think about that, and then come back when you know what you want to say. But just acknowledge that you've heard it, that this was hard, that this is challenging. I think we're pressured a lot to feel like we need to be perfect and know exactly the right words in the moment. And it's all right to take some time and space to find those.
As a parent, that's really lovely to hear. I think that oftentimes we probably are our own worst critics, and we expect to know all the things because we're parents, that we should always have the answer. And it's just nice to kind of have that permission to be able to say, I don't know the right thing right now, but what you're saying is important to me, and let me find out, let me think about it so that I can help you find a good solution or a better answer, or how to best handle this. I think that's really nice to hear you say that. I think often as parents, we kind of need someone to say, like, it's okay to not be the expert in absolutely everything. Well, we're at this point in the podcast where we have questions from parents. So I'm really excited. We had quite a few parents reach out and ask questions about listening. So one of our listeners, Jack, asked, how do you know when someone feels like they aren't heard?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that can manifest in a lot of different ways. But I think that one of the things that I notice when someone feels like they haven't been heard is that they start saying the same thing over and over and over again, and sometimes in different ways. And to me, that's a signal that there needs to be some kind of acknowledgement, an opportunity to say, yes, I hear what you're saying. And acknowledgement, I just want to be really clear, is different than agreeing with someone, because you don't need to necessarily agree with what someone's saying to acknowledge that you've heard them, right? And that's a really big differentiation. I might not agree with what you're saying, but I can say, I heard you say this. And then that I've at least processed what you were trying to tell me. And so I think that distinguishment is important. But but the key signs that I see is that kind of repetition. And so I think that's what I'd say is the most common of someone realizing that they're not being heard.
Yeah, and I think those are really good things to just, for us as parents, to stop and think about. Because you're right, there are times your children will repeat things because they don't feel heard or that you fully understand. And I really like making that distinction between I hear you and acknowledge you versus I agree with everything that you're saying. I think those are good things to kind of separate, because it's not one and the same. Just because I hear someone doesn't mean I agree with them. And so I think teaching that skill at a young age is really helpful too. I'm sure Jack will find that information super helpful.
Yes, and I often use with my 3-year-old on a regular basis. It sounds like you have some really big feelings around that. Is that right? And that helps. Usually she'll say yes.
Yes, for sure. That's a great way to phrase it and help a child learn to connect to their own feelings and also feel acknowledged.
Right.
You may not agree with their big feeling of, dumping their milk on the ground or throwing something across the room, but you acknowledge their feelings and help them identify them too.
Right. And it also just helps them to calm down a little bit, because often when they're talking in that way, they'll be upset, right? They're trying to tell you something and they're not feeling heard and they're not feeling understood. And instead of being calm, right, they get escalated, right? They get worried about things and it starts to turn into a little kid tantrum. And so using that kind of acknowledgement really helps them to feel heard, to know that they're actually understood, and it gives them the opportunity to kind of calm themselves down and be able to kind of move forward with whatever needs to happen next.
That's wonderful advice. We have a second listener who reached out, Beverly, said, we have been talking about how to listen with empathy to our kids, but how do we get our kids to listen with empathy? Now that's a good one. We've been talking a lot about how we as parents can listen with empathy, but how do you teach that skill to your children, which is an essential life skill?
Absolutely. And what a good question. I know we're always working on this, so we certainly can't expect that our kids will be able to listen perfectly right away, right? So that modeling is a perfect opportunity to show kids how you are listening to them so that they can listen to you in a similar way. And don't we expect that of kids sometimes when we're talking to them? We say things like, well, turn around. I'd like you to look at me. I'd like you to pay attention. I want you to focus on what I'm saying. I mean, these are all things we articulate to them on a regular basis, but modeling and showing them is worth 1,000 words, because then you're able to say, when you speak, I always turn towards you and turn off my phone and make eye contact. I expect the same of you when you're talking to me and when I'm talking to you, so that there's that modeling piece of things. And I think the biggest thing is that I think of it as a developmental skill, this learning how to focus and listen. And so it takes practice, right? We can't expect that they're going to be good right away. It is a work in progress. Think about it. We're having a conversation for parents on how to listen. So we certainly can't expect that they are going to be perfect at this at the time that they're so young. So the other thing I would say that I think is really helpful would be read with them, because I think that when you connect over a book, there's an opportunity then to have some conversation, and you can practice some really good listening and empathy skills when you're reading and when you're having that conversation back and forth, identifying as you read feelings that characters are having so that they have an understanding of those feelings and how to talk about them. I think that those are really helpful parts. And we also have some really great kind of book lists as well that I think would be useful for doing that kind of empathy sort of work. Overall, the fact that kids want to tell us things and have us listen, I think is a huge gift, because we are trying to connect with them as parents. And so making sure that they feel heard is an important part of helping them also know what it's like to be listened to, and gives them the opportunity to do the same for others.
Those are all wonderful kind of steps on how we can, role model and help our children develop empathetic listening skills. Those are really, really great. Thank you for those. Our final question from a parent is from Emily. And her question is, what resources does Doing Good Together have for parents about listening?
So we have quite a few resources that I think would be a good fit for listening. We have a great newsletter on the power of listening, and so that would be one to kind of read and follow some of the ideas in there. We also have a great blog on difficult conversations, which in light of recent news can definitely be a useful sort of piece for families, I think. We have great worksheets on feelings, words, and how to express oneself. And so I think those would be excellent ideas. I think teaching kids to use those I statements that I talked about that identify feelings and connects to them with why they feel that way is a useful sort of skill as well. I don't know if you've read this book, but I love the book, The Rabbit Listened. It's a wonderful book. It talks about listening in a very simple way, and it also shows that how sometimes the presence of someone is actually more important than what's being said. And so I think that's just a good reminder that trying and being there for our kids is so important and shows that you care. And just the fact that you're listening to this podcast, trying to improve your listening skills, shows that you really want to be there and connected to your young person. And I think that speaks volumes. The last piece that I would say is just our book lists, our reading lists, and conversation starters, because those are, again, great places to talk about empathy, to talk about feelings, to connect with kids, and to do that back and forth asking of questions so that there's some practice. And remember, kids will get better, and so will you as you kind of practice your listening skills.
That's lovely that there are so many resources, and I really like that there are great things to help. Great books to read, and also resources to help with feelings, because it's much easier to learn about feelings when you're calm and doing a fun activity versus trying to learn it in kind of the heat of the moment, so to speak. If I'm having a meltdown, it's a lot harder to connect with my feelings and be able to articulate all that. But if I have these skills and resources and tools that are available with Doing Good Together, and I've done those over time, in kind of that stressful moment, I might be able to find the words to talk about how I feel and use those I statements. So it's great that we can use these resources, not just in the moment, but always, that it helps develop those important skills. So thank you to you and your organization for having those wonderful resources.
Well, absolutely. We're grateful that we have people who can use them and who are working on raising kids that care and contribute.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you again, MiaLisa, for joining us today. It's always great to have you on the podcast, and you are always welcome back. You're a wealth of knowledge. I think you help us tremendously learn more about what we can do to enhance our skills as a parent. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I'm really delighted to be here. I'll come back anytime.
Great. And listeners, if you want more information on this episode or need access to other resources mentioned, you can visit our website at www.nhacademy.net. And if you have any questions, you can email us at theparentingpickup@nhacademy.net.